Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, President of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. Good to see you all again. Come and visit us at fff.org to get the uncompromising perspective on libertarianism, and which is what you get in this show. And I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to see you and our viewers and listeners.
All right, Richard, let's try something different this week. I don't know if we'll manage it, but we'll give it a try. Let's try to discuss two different subjects within our half-hour or so show. And the first subject being what's going on with respect to Saudi Arabia. The next subject is kind of interesting. That's the bankruptcy of Sears, Roebuck and Company. So let's begin with the Saudi situation. You know, this guy, a Saudi citizen, Khashoggi, enters the Saudi embassy or consulate in Turkey. He's going in there to get some kind of documentation on his divorce. He's also been a critic of the Saudi regime. He's living outside of Saudi Arabia because he's scared of what they might do to him. But he feels safe in walking into this consulate and getting this document that had been ordered on his behalf. And so he had an appointment there. And suddenly his fiancée is standing outside the consulate, and he doesn't come out, and he never comes out. But the Saudi regime says, oh, yes, he left the embassy. We don't know where he is now, but he left. Well, then there's anonymous information coming out of the Turkish authorities saying that a team of Saudi agents came into the country flying on private planes, and they included an autopsy expert with a bone saw. And then the anonymous sources of the Turkish deep state also revealed that they had videotapes and audio tapes of the actual murder of Khashoggi inside the consulate. And meantime, the Saudi officials, the king, the crown prince who was supposed to be behind all this, a guy named bin Salman, are all denying any knowledge of this. But the latest news is that President Trump has floated the idea that maybe this was done by rogue agents, and the speculation is that the Saudi regime might try to blame this on rogue agents and doing an interrogation that apparently might have gone awry. Meanwhile, you've got the U.S. government funneling, massive amounts of cash and armaments into Saudi Arabia as part of America's foreign policy. Trump has said, regardless of what happens, even if they're found to have committed just sheer murder here, state-sponsored murder or assassination, that he has no intentions of canceling a huge arms agreement that his regime negotiated, because he said it would cost jobs for the military-industrial complex. And so this obviously raises lots of different questions, Richard, but the question that I really would like to raise for Americans to consider is one that entails breaking out of the status box. I mean, everybody's debating, should the U.S. government punish Saudi Arabia by canceling this arms deal or canceling other foreign aid to the Saudi regime, foreign aid to the Saudi regime? My question entails breaking out of this box and says, why should there be any foreign aid at all? I mean, maybe this is a good opportunity for Americans to be asking that question. Everybody's struggling. They're having difficult time saving money, or at least most people are. Young people are having tough time. A lot of them are still living at home in their 30s. They can't get married because they don't have enough savings to buy a house, put a down payment on. And people lament that they go through all their work lives without being able to save money because the state takes so much money from them. Well, part of what they're taking the money for is this foreign aid, not just to dictatorial regimes and corrupt regimes like Saudi Arabia, but also to democratic regimes. My question is, why not furnish this as an opportunity to just consider ceasing, terminating all federal aid at all? Why is this a legitimate function of government, to be taking money from the hard-earned money from the American people and giving it to foreign governments? Your turn.
Well, what can I say? Several layers of this before I get to the particular, more general point that you're trying to make. There is an essential, how can I put it, hypocrisy, inconsistency, contradiction, political manipulation when we suddenly see this outrage about this one journalist who does have a U.S. green card. Therefore, he's not a citizen, but he has a legitimate legal right to reside and work in the United States. This one individual suffers what clearly is this despicable and tragic and horrific fate, going under torture, and I assume not pleasantly, and then being the parts could be gotten out of the consulate without too much notice, one presumes. When all the time the United States government has been an accomplice to mass murder on the part of the Saudi government. And what do I mean by mass murder? I refer to the Saudi military and political intervention in the neighboring country of Yemen. There is a civil war going on in Yemen. There are two factions. One faction claims an allegiance or a loyalty or empathy with the government of Iran. The Iranian government is viewed as a challenger and a competitor for Mideast influence and supremacy against the Saudi government and their allies. So the Saudi government decided to intervene militarily into the Yemen civil war, with the consequence that this has now been dragging out for years, and the Saudis have not only armed the side of the civil war that they support, but they have militarily intervened directly, particularly with aerial bombardments of cities, towns, and communities, with the result that literally hundreds, if not thousands, of unarmed innocent civilians, men, women, and children, have been murdered through these military actions by the Saudi government, all as part of their political power play for influence and severe spheres of influence in the Middle East in comparison to their rival Iran. Now, who has assisted them in this? The United States government. We have supplied them with intelligence because our eyes are everywhere. We have supplied them with military armaments to replenish their depleted inventories as they use these weapons in their attacks in Yemen. And we implicitly give them diplomatic cover in this endeavor. Yet, after having therefore been an accomplice, a supporter, a financial subsidizer of what is a grievous act of inhumanity among neighboring peoples, we suddenly become aroused and shocked because one individual who has written critical articles about the Saudi government for the Washington Post and has a legal green card status in the United States has suffered this terrible fate. Now, without in any way diminishing the loss of his life and the uniqueness of him as a human being, that if this has happened, it is reprehensible. It is a great inconsistency and contradiction and hypocrisy to say, I'm shocked, when the very government that has done this is a government that you have collaborated with in the deaths and the maiming of hundreds, if not thousands. Now, this all then finally gets to the point that you're raising, Jacob. What the hell are we in the business of supporting monarchs, tyrants, despots, dictators, democratic regimes, all of whom use American taxpayer money to prop up their own political status and power in their home countries? Who is it that the U.S. government and its bureaucrats and experts presume to know how our taxpayer dollars should be spent for supposed good guys versus bad guys, when invariably all we're doing is enabling one political elite to manipulate and manage their people for their own benefit at the expense of other citizens and other groups who, for one reason or another, are in opposition to them? This is outrageous. This is absurd. The United States government should not be in the business of subsidizing foreign governments, defined however you may by as good or evil, saintly or sinful, when in the process it results inevitably and inescapably in the use of those diplomatic and military sums to oppress and violate the rights of others. This should not be a responsibility of the United States government, a duty, an obligation. It is one that the U.S. government has chosen to take on since the end of the Second World War. But if we go back to the founding principles upon which the United States was established, and to think of George Washington's famous inaugural address, farewell address, excuse me, in which he has that famous line, commerce and trade with all, but but entanglements with none, by which he meant military and political entanglements. That should be the hearkening principle to which we should return, because this is shocking and terrible, and is merely the tip of an iceberg of a terrible legacy that one administration after another has followed since the time, first of Woodrow Wilson in the First World War, and then in a consistent and persistent way since Franklin Roosevelt during the Second World War.
Now, those are great points. And I think there is the distinct possibility that if this rogue agent theory grabs hold, there's the possibility that the Trump administration is going to play along with it, instead of saying, hey, there should be a full investigation to see if this really was a state-sponsored assassination. And these, you're right about the founding principle of America, was Jefferson pointed out too, against entangling alliances with foreign regimes. And ever since the end of World War II and the adoption of a national security state way of life by the U.S. government, you have these regime change operations where we install these brutal dictators into power, like in Iran, when the CIA ousts Mossadegh from power, the democratically elected prime minister of the country, and installs the Shah of Iran that initiates an enormously tyrannical regime there, along with his Savak police, national police intelligence military force that was torturing and killing Iranians. I mean, that really is the root of the Iran-U.S. relations today. And you had it in '53 in Guatemala, where they oust the democratically elected president, install a brutal military dictator. Same in '73 with Pinochet, and it goes on today. I mean, you've got massive military aid going into Egypt, which is a massive national security state military dictatorship. You've got the Saudi Arabian situation. The U.S. has no business doing this. And this is what we libertarians are trying to challenge Americans with, is to say, hey, look, break out of this box. Instead of thinking in terms of, hey, should we punish this dictator or should we not punish him by denying him foreign aid? Hey, let's just stop foreign aid entirely and get out of these entangling alliances and talk in terms of concentrating on the freedom and the prosperity and the limited government philosophy on which America was founded. So,
yeah,
go ahead.
Since Franklin Roosevelt, this has been the mindset. You know, there's a story that during the Second World War, in one of his press conferences in the Oval Office, Franklin Roosevelt was asked by one of the reporters there, why is it that the United States opposed fascist dictators like Mussolini and Hitler as the war was then being fought, but supported dictators in places like the Dominican Republic in the Caribbean? To which Franklin Roosevelt supposedly replied with his cigarette lighter positioned in between his teeth, that fellow may be a fascist, but he's our fascist. And that's the mindset. This is the mindset that as long as some foreign government and leader, and in many cases over the last 70-odd years since 1945, tyrants, dictators, brutal despots, as long as they support American foreign policy, give us their vote in the United Nations, allow American political and diplomatic and military use or presence on their territories, then everything is fine. Everything can be covered over. And then if at some point that person becomes unusable or an embarrassment, then you just shove him aside and you're shocked that such a tyrant should be existing. It is the most crass and crude realpolitik of power lusting and power manipulation. And that is the reality. Where are the principles of freedom, rights, and a legitimate function of government? And a teasing out of what freedom and rights and a constitutionally limited government should and really mean to preserve freedom and not to abridge freedom. To preserve the freedom not only of the American citizen from inappropriate taxation, that has nothing to do with protection of what's called negative freedom, life, liberty, and property, national defense properly understood, but to also not abuse Americans by sending them to serve or die in foreign conflicts, or to bleed the American taxpayer, as you were saying, with tax dollars that they could easily more legitimately use for their own interests and concerns as individuals, family members, perhaps their own advancements of instead take those tax dollars from the hard-working Americans and redistribute them to governments that have their own agendas to maintain their power, and historically often at the physical and cruel, brutal oppression of their own peoples. It is outrageous, and that is the basis upon which criticism should be laid, and not this issue, well, you know, he was an American resident, and how dare they do this, and just shove over under the rug everything else, and then try to cover this over because, well, you know, they're our ally in the Middle East, and we do have all those armament contracts, and we are, after it, Trump says, all about jobs for Americans. The hypocrisy, you know, let me go back to an example. In the 1700s, when there emerged the movement to abolish slavery in the British Empire, there was a fellow named Grenville, and he stood up alone, and as a non-lawyer, wrote briefs and took these issues to court for the freedom of slaves. And at one point, he said, it doesn't matter if the slave owners lose revenue, have to pay wages, see the demand for their markets fall. It is a moral principle that people should be recognized as free by nature and their natural rights. And money should not be a matter of this in the matters of principle. Well, who cares if some armaments or aircraft company loses a contract because it's not funded or subsidized by the U.S. government? The protection and the securing of liberty and the limiting of government to assure freedom is far more important in the long run for all of us than losing a contract and a quarterly dividend that you shouldn't be earning at all if it's at taxpayers' expense.
Yeah, it really goes to show this jobs argument for the military-industrial complex really goes to show the moral degeneracy of this entire system. I mean, it boggles the mind that anyone who would even make that argument. And another example of an earlier point you made was Cuba. That here the whole Cold War is fought over this communist dictator, and he is a communist dictator, Fidel Castro or was. But they have this big embargo that inflicts massive suffering on the Cuban people along with their socialist system. But it was all because the U.S. was upset that they had lost their fascist dictator, who was Batista, who was every bit as brutal as Castro was. And the U.S. says, yeah, but he was our dictator, and so that made him okay. All right, let's shift gears here. Let's go to Sears and Roebuck, because it's a totally different issue, but it really is a fascinating one because, you know, Sears has filed Chapter 11 bankruptcy. And way back in the 1920s and 30s, and when we were growing up, you know, the Sears catalog was the big thing. I mean, they were sort of the Amazon of their time. They had a catalog that sold like everything, sort of like Amazon does today online. And they were prosperous. They were enormous. They were what you and I were learning in our economics classes in college and high school, an oligopoly. You know, this enormous company that has so much power, like what they're saying about Amazon today. I mean, there's people saying that the Justice Department needs to look at Amazon and possibly break it up. Well, you know, the Sears is a classic example of how a market economy works. That as long as you have a free market and freedom of entry, freedom of competition, no business is secure, no matter how big it is. And Sears is a classic example of this. It was huge, enormous. but because of market forces, because Sears failed to satisfy consumer demand, especially as the internet age dawned on America, they started losing market share. And it finally got to a point where they end up in bankruptcy. But the point is that you don't need a Sherman antitrust law like you know the statists have long argued to bust up these monopolies and oligopolies, which is what they call them. But they're nothing of the sort. They're just big, successful companies. They have figured out how to satisfy consumer demand for a certain period of time. But they're always subject to the possibility that somebody comes along and offers a better mousetrap. In fact, I think that if you looked at the largest companies 20 years ago, or much less 40 years ago, it's very rare that any of those companies are still in the top 20 or the top 40. That's because they did not retain market share. So you don't really need an antitrust law. You don't need the Justice Department to break up companies. The market itself, the free market, is the big redistributor of income and resources. If you fail to meet market share, consumer demand, you lose market share. And that's the virtue of the free market. It becomes the redistributor of income simply by catering to the needs of consumers.
All of this is an example of what the Austrian-born economist Joseph Schumpeter expressed in 1942 in his famous book, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, as the winds and gales of creative destruction. By which he meant is that the true dynamism of a free, open, competitive capitalist system is that it allows innovators, creative and far-seeing entrepreneurs to enter any market with their own funds, partnering with those who are willing to support them financially, or with borrowed funds to whom they can present a sufficiently reasonable and persuasive business plan to lend them the money and enter a market with a new idea, a new product, a new technology, a new way of organizing the enterprises to do it in a more cost-efficient and consumer-oriented way, better than the existing firms. This is the history. For example, if we look at the 19th century started with sailing ships, right? The ships with the big sails across the Atlantic. Then in the middle of the 19th century came the steamship, and those came to dominate, and the sailing vessels went their way. And then in the 20th century, we saw that the airplane replaced the sailing ship for either some cargo, but certainly for passenger travel. The same thing occurred through land transportation. In early American times, if you wanted to get somewhere, you either walked, or you rode a horse, or you had a horse-drawn wagon, or you traveled by coastal rivers from one place to another. And then there came the railway. And the railway then became replaced in the 20th century by the automobile and the highway. And then the airplane for passenger travel as well. And all of this saw changes in what was produced and how it was produced in firms. I mean, I'm sure that the horse and buggy industry was crying the blues in the early 20th century against the automobile. Oh, we're losing market share. Our profits are down. Nobody needs a horse and buggy anymore. A buggy whip. It's terrible. Oh, if there ought to be a law, there ought to be a subsidy. Well, of course, at that time in the U.S., government didn't do very much of that, and so they couldn't do that. And what happened? The new innovative replacement industry emerged. Jobs developed there. Jobs diminished in other corners of the market. Again, if I can just continue with Jacob, it's this idea that, it loses jobs, it causes problems for the economy. I am old enough to remember, by golly, movies from watching on TV, movies from the 1940s, or as a little kid in the 1950s. And if there was an office scene in these movies, what was a common thing portrayed? The typing pool. The typing pool had all of these typists, usually women, but not always, bills sent out, correspondence, internal memos, delivery of reports to stockholders. Everything had to be typed. And the big boss had a secretary who did shorthand. And then what happened? Within a few decades, with the emergence of the modern desktop and then laptop computer, all of that disappeared. Everybody did their own typing, their own correcting, their own printing, and all of the jobs and the transformation of all of these things, and jobs are lost, business. Well, oh, the old-fashioned mechanical typewriter. Whoa, we're going bankrupt. The fact is that the world had created replacement jobs, created efficiency, improved products, human convenience. Again, if I can just continue with this, I remember when I first started to be a professor, I would write my papers, and I'd have to give it to the department secretary to type for me. And then I would correct her typed version, and then she would have to retype it. The time consumption, the wastefulness. Now all of us do our own typing, and we have spell checks and grammar checks and our own corrections, and end of story. In a sense, we're much more efficient, productive, and able to go about our business. And these things change. Now, Sears and Roebuck, as you said, Jacob, was the path breaker for this. In the late 19th century, when America was far less interconnected, the Sears catalog was the most innovative thing in the world. How could people living out in the countryside, the prairie, the Rocky Mountains, the deserts of the Southwest, how could they get access to anything? And here comes the Sears catalog. And now you can order it, and through the mail would come anything at reasonable prices for the standards of living of that day. That was the internet. That was buying over the internet. That was the Sears catalog. The problem is technology's changed. Innovative ways of managing companies and the structure of the enterprise has changed. And Sears, like many more brick and mortar companies, have not developed ways to transition, develop ways. And bad management, if one reads the accounts of senior management in choosing misdirected ways of using the revenues they had, not beefing up and renovating existing facilities, making them unattractive and dingy. People didn't find it aesthetically to go to Sears stores and so on. So bad management and not keeping ahead of the technologies of the time have resulted in this. Other businesses have mastered the internet. They still have brick and mortar stores. Many have not. Borders bookstore is gone. Barnes & Noble is still there. And in spite of Amazon's massive market in book selling, both at the beginning and still today. So this is a lesson of the market working, which was your point, Jacob. The market is working. Those who have better ideas capture consumer business, larger market share, profit margins. Those who fail to keep up with the changing gales of creative destruction see market share diminished, profits going down, and if they are unable to mend their ways, they pass into history. Now, Sears will always have a notable and respectable and important chapter in the history of American business in the 19th and 20th century. Honorable, mentionable, but they could not master the changing winds of market circumstances. And rightly so, they've now passed into bankruptcy, just as someday Amazon might, if it fails to continue to match that market test.
Yeah, what you're implying is that freedom can be a dangerous thing. I mean, you may lose your job. You may have your entire industry, like if you specialize in buggy whips in 1900, you may be put out of business by the automobile industry. But the opposite of this, which is really the European method, is the security, that we're going to protect your jobs. We're going to have government secure the buggy whip industry with subsidies and protectionism. The opposite of that is much worse than the dangers that come with freedom in a free market, because then you end up having not only suppression of economic prosperity, the growth in people's standard of living overall, but you also have the denial of freedom that comes, the tyrannical state that comes with protecting you. So it's that age-old conflict which people have to resolve. Do you want a free society? Do you want a secure society, or what purports to be a secure society but ends up not being secure at all? Let me share with you an interesting aspect of this Sears stories that my colleague Bart brought to my attention this morning. There's a Washington Post article today that talks about how the Sears catalog was actually a device, not by intention, but just by the spontaneity of the free market. It was the device by which blacks were able to circumvent the Jim Crow attitudes and mindsets and policies that were taking place in department stores, especially in the South, where they could just order things through the catalog instead of having to put up with the abuse that they would find in the stores. And I thought, wow, that's a fascinating aspect of a free market that I'd never even thought about.
You know, I personally value freedom and have confidence in freedom as much that I do these videos with you, Jacob. Even if we end up being so persuasive that liberty triumphs and you're out of a job.
Let's not go that far. Let's not go that far. We want to advance liberty. We do not want to achieve it. Now you've really gone cross the line and become a real extremist here. All right. On that positive note, let's wrap things up. If you want to know more about FFF, come to our website at fff.org. We link to we publish an article, reprint an article that Richard writes every week. We've got, of course, the Libertarian Angle. We have a video podcast series now that we recently launched. I've got one weekly series on the JFK assassination that's garnering considerable attention and comments. Richard's got his economic straight talk, and we've got articles and blogs and all from this uncompromising libertarian perspective. So, Richard, as always, greatly enjoyed the conversation. It looks like our formula of dealing with two topics worked this week, and
Yes.
Look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time, and let me just, once again, as I try to always, thank the viewers and listeners for sharing a little bit of their time with us to talk about freedom.
Yeah, thanks for your comments and your emails and your comments on our YouTube site, and we'll look forward to seeing you all next week.